Most apologists are con men, we know that already, but some, a very select few, finally get a grip on the real world and start looking at how bad religion actually is. Today, we're going to take a look at that and point out some of the vestiges of religious delusion that need to be excised. And this is a very good thing coming up next. The more that I see of the new modern Randal Rauser, the more I like him. I mean, kind of anyhow. Because, like other well-read theologians like Dan McClellan, I have no idea how he can still believe any of this bullshit, understanding what he understands. Now, I'll talk more about that as we go on, I'm sure, but it really strikes me like an astronaut being a flat earther. You've seen the reality with your own eyes, yet you have to reject it to maintain your own irrational beliefs. I don't really see that as something to be proud of. Also, I'm not going to break this up into 2 videos, so this is going to be pretty long, so I guess there is that. Anyhow, let's see what Randall has to say today.
Most of the time, evidence isn't the issue for people. They don't want Christianity to be true.
Oh look, one of the most dishonest apologist pricks out there ever. Now, I've been saying that forever, but of late, I've seen a lot of atheist content creators kind of coming around. In fact, a lot of the people who used to respect, and that's got some pretty massive air quotes around it, William Lane Craig, are finally starting to admit that he's just a con man too. Over the past, I don't know, maybe year, more and more atheist content creators are starting to take on my tone with regard to religion and especially to religious apologists. They really are idiots, and it's fair to call them out on it. In fact, we should.
Because they don't want to give up their autonomy to a God who is in control.
Thanks for telling us what we think, Frank, you fucking imbecile. But this is something that we've seen 1,000 times before, right? In fact, I think that clip looks familiar enough that we've probably done that exact video in the past. Not that Frank doesn't say the exact same thing all the time, because he does, but everything starts to look identical after a while, right? Not only are the religious dishonest, since they never change their tune even when they are shown to be wrong, but they're all just a bunch of money-grubbing assholes. What the hell else is new?
They want to be God.
I used to think the way that Frank Turek does in that clip.
Gasp in horror! Sudden Randal Rauser! Hey, Randall! Now, I'll let him get on to his points in a second. That's really what we're here to talk about after all. But I wanted to finish up on Frank Turek first, so just indulge me for a second. Because I think that people like Frank are really going the way of the dodo these days. There's only so long that you can go on with a concentrated effort to show how wrong you are going outside your door all the time. And that's what's happening today for modern day apologists. You get the ones that fall beneath notice most of the times, although I do try to do even small channels when I can, because all of them are wrong. Some of the videos that we've done around here have been taken down, not necessarily because of us, but because the world is waking up and taking notice of how stupid these people are and not being afraid to speak up and point it all out. And that's kind of a good thing. I think it's only a matter of time before the current crop of apologists start to suddenly retire. I mean, Frank Turek is 63, William Lane Craig is 75, Ken Ham is 73. I figure it can't be too much longer until they all just give up the ghost and go off to enjoy their ill-gotten gains. And I'm not seeing a lot of people taking up that mantle, at least not big names. And if you know anybody who might be in the next generation of big name apologists, let me know what you think down in the comments. I mean, we might as well be ready, right?
I remember 30 plus years ago, probably about 1993, there was a debate on the existence of God between William Lane Craig and famous or infamous Canadian abortion doctor Henry Morgentaler at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I saw that debate.
I did too. Granted, these days, I don't even bother to watch debates anymore because, as you well know, I think most debates, at least traditional debates, are a complete waste of time. The religious have learned how to weaponize the format with things like the Gish Gallop, and skeptics have to just try to turn it back on them, and nothing really ever gets accomplished, and both sides leave the debate with exactly the same positions that they came into it with. And that just proves how pointless the whole thing is right there. It's all just preaching and not about reaching a single, logical, rational, evidence-based conclusion. And without that, who the hell cares? So modern debates are a complete waste of time, just like talking to most religious zealots. I've got better things to do with my time than listen to a rational idiot spewing nonsense, don't you?
And they went back and forth on the existence of God and the truth of Christianity. As you can expect, Morgentaler, not himself being a philosopher of religion, did not really have sophisticated arguments for his views or against Craig's views. But in the discussion portion of the evening, somebody from the audience, probably, I'm guessing, a young budding apologist from Campus Crusade for Christ or InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, he stood and he asked a question of Morgentaler, which at the time I thought was a profound question. He said, "If Christianity were true, Dr. Morgentaler, would you bow to God?"
And that person was Frank Turek, right? I don't know, just a guess, but it would make sense, wouldn't it? Because he's still pulling that bullshit to this day. My answer, as I've given it many times before, is no, because these are just two entirely different questions being conflated. If Christianity is true, and keep in mind, if is not because, but if it was demonstrably and backed up by evidence, would I accept it? Absolutely. I'd go where the evidence leads. However, it's an entirely different matter to expect that I would bow down to the moral monster in the Bible just because he happened to be real. That's because I am looking at this differently than the religious do. They are acting out of fear. A real God could smite their asses, so hey, they're just going to bow down and worship it out of terror. But I'm not doing that. I would look at the real God that has now been proven to exist with demonstrable evidence and see if they have earned my worship. Because they need to do that. And the Christian God simply hasn't. Quite the opposite, in fact. But see, our goals are completely different. Mine is to get to the truth. Theirs is to get to comfort. That's why we're speaking two entirely different languages. And that's not a good thing.
And Morgentaler responded and said, "No, I would not. I would not bow to anyone."
That's not far off my response, as I said, but not exactly. Would I ever bow down to anyone? Well, it depends on the being in question. Of course, as far as I'm concerned, anyone who expects me to bow down and worship them already has lost my respect because that's a wholly unrealistic and irrational desire to begin with. An all-powerful God doesn't need worship. They wouldn't desire worship. Therefore, the fact that they do already proves how unworthy they actually are. And since I'm not going into this terrified of their silly spook in the sky, I can certainly understand the response and might give a similar one myself.
And at the time, I thought that was the most important question of the evening, and that it revealed that this was not really a debate about the truth of Christianity or the existence of God, but about whether Henry Morgentaler would be willing to worship God.
Well, he's got some of that right because these debates are never about the existence of a God or the truth of a religion, because the theist goes into it with blind faith that cannot be shaken no matter what comes up during the course of the debate. Like I said, it is all just a complete waste of time. In fact, if you watch debates about the existence of God, the theist never really addresses it at all. They just assume it, but they never produce any evidence or any arguments to actually back it up, right? In fact, at least in my opinion, that's the failure of a lot of atheist debaters, that they don't hold the theist's feet to the fire and insist that they actually debate what they're supposedly there to debate. You should never let them off the hook, because the entire question of religion is moot until a real existing God has been evidentially demonstrated to exist first. There is no point whatsoever in having a discussion about anything else otherwise. The God claim has to be rationally justified, and until it has been rationally justified, everything else just goes out the window regardless. It's stupid to debate dogma when your basic claim that your God is real hasn't been justified first. Religion becomes a complete waste of time, as we already know that it is. So why bother?
And that's really the same kind of thing that Frank Turek is talking about in his clip from a longer video, which is that, on his view, as he says, most people don't want Christianity to be true, and they would thus not accept the arguments for it, even if they were overwhelming.
Because Frank is in it for one thing and one thing only. He wants to increase the pool of gullible suckers who will buy his books and pay for his talks. That is Frank's goal. He'd never be honest about it, but come on, we know that's what's actually going on. Because, like I said, they're after comfort and we're after truth. We want to know if there really is a God out there, and they only want to make more Christians, so they make more money. The same thing goes for almost all the other religions as well. They just want to make everyone just like they are. We are fundamentally at odds here, and therefore the chances of the religious ever having anything intelligent to say that the non-religious will respond to or accept, that's somewhere between slim and none. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?
And I think that that is exactly the wrong way to think about skeptics, atheists, non-Christians. I think that that poisons the well of conversation with other people, and it lets the apologist off the hook, so that when their arguments don't succeed, as very often they do not, in persuading their interlocutor, the apologist can just say, well, that's just because they're in sinful rebellion against God. That's why they don't accept my arguments for the existence of God or the truth of Christianity.
I'm sure that plays into it, at least to some degree. More likely, it's because we have vastly different goals in mind. They don't really care if their God is real. Let's be honest, they don't. That's why they use faith and we use facts. So long as it makes them feel good, they'll go with it, because at the end of the day, they're just looking for emotional comfort, and we don't care about that at all. We are talking directly to them, or at least trying, and they aren't interested in us at all. They are pandering to their existing followers because that's where all the money and power is. That's what virtually all of them are after, at least the big names. Even the church pastors realize that's what they have to do. They've got this big building to pay for, and the only way to make a buck is to appeal to the idiots in the pews every Sunday morning. Therefore, they do what churches have done since time immemorial. They guilt-trip their followers into throwing money into the collection plate. They structure their entire service to encourage additional giving, and then they get mad if people don't pony up enough cash. That's why religion is a business. It has to be. That's why most of these people are just con men. They can't be dumb enough not to know that's what they're doing.
Now, it's always possible that that is the case, but that doesn't mean it's likely that it is the case, or that you can conclude and assume that it is in fact the case. It may very well be that in fact the real issue is you failed to make persuasive apologetic.
No theist in the history of the world has ever made a rationally persuasive apologetic. That's the problem. That's why they're only after pushing the emotional side. You just have to listen to them to see it in action. They are not remotely interested in the truth. They have no evidence. They just want people to feel good. So they will just throw more money in the plate and finance the apologist's new car. Now, I don't know anything about how Randall operates, or did. I'm sure there are plenty of them out there that really believe this stuff, but only because they don't care enough to seek out the actual truth and go where the evidence leads, no matter where that is. Wanting something to be true doesn't make it true after all. That's why religion is ultimately such a scam, because it's not interested in verifiable reality. And if any gods were actually real and demonstrably so, they would be part of verifiable reality. The religious are not remotely interested in any of that. They've got sheep to fleece. That's what this is all about, even if the individual theist isn't aware that that's what's going on.
Go back to Henry Morgentaler for a second. Something I didn't really think enough about, I believe, at the time was that he survived the concentration camps of World War II as a Jew. What would it mean for him in his mind to think that Christianity is true?
It doesn't really matter. There was an inscription by a Jewish prisoner who died, presumably, since we don't actually know who wrote it, in a concentration camp that said, if there is a God, he will have to beg my forgiveness. Now, it doesn't actually prove whether or not there is a God. There could be a God and the Holocaust still happened. One's beliefs do not actually color reality. There's a lot of shitty stuff that goes on out there in the name of religion, but that doesn't actually have anything to do with the existence of any gods. They're either there or they're not. How you feel about it doesn't matter.
Well, what it would mean was that there was a providential God who oversaw and allowed the Holocaust to happen. And I can understand from the perspective of someone like Henry Morgentaler, in many respects, that's a terrifying idea that there is a deity, a powerful being who foresaw from eternity that Hitler would round up 6 million Jews and gas them in concentration camps. And God allowed that to happen for his own providential purposes.
That's not really how I'd be looking at it, though. Now, I can't speak for some guy in a debate 30 years ago, and I'm not even going to bother to try, but I'm more concerned about the first part of the question than I am about the second. If, as we know, is never because. I don't care if Christianity is true, I care that Christianity is true. And the only way to get there is to have evidence presented that shows that it is actually true. It's only after we do that, once that God is actually proven to be there, that we can even address the second part of joining the Christian cult. That question is entirely irrelevant until the first part is established evidentially. The religious are jumping over that because they already believe the first part is true, but they're talking to people who absolutely do not believe it. They're just assuming that everyone is just like they are, and we're not. That's why you see so many of them saying, oh, but you already believe, you're just lying. You know, my book says a thing. No, we're not. Saying that just makes us laugh at your ass, more so than we're already doing. You actually have to be able to back this stuff up with evidence, and as we all know, you're not even trying.
That's a terrifying prospect. I can understand why someone like Morgentaler, certainly someone like Morgentaler who would experience that from the inside, would be very resistant to worshiping such a being.
That's not how I'm seeing this, and remember, I can't even begin to address what somebody else might think, but I'm not resistant to worshiping anything given all the prerequisites that would have to come first. Prove to me that this being is real first, with evidence, and then prove to me that it deserves my worship, and hey, I'll do it. If you can't, I won't. And as I keep saying, they're not even trying to do that. That's really something that we need to understand about the religious. They have no evidence, they only have faith. If you have evidence, you don't need faith. You just present the evidence, and you don't insist that you have to have faith. So long as faith is part of the equation, they have nothing else of substance. That's why if doesn't matter. The time to care about any of this is when, not if. When you've proven Christianity is true and presented the evidence that your God exists, and you can do that to people who don't already believe the crap that's in your head, then you can talk about the next part and not one instant before. But they can't do that, can they? And that's why they fail.
What that illustrates is that this is not, in fact, a simple question, as Frank Turek would have us believe it is. Rather, it is a loaded question for many people.
Because that's how Frank operates. Frank is a dishonest prick. He's certainly not alone in that, because most apologists are like that. They are trying to manipulate people into the most advantageous position for them, personally. They use people to their own benefit. We can't be afraid to call a spade a spade. That's what's really going on here. Frank is trying to win, and his definition of winning is making more cash machines for his wallet to suck money from. Religion is just a scam. It always has been, and it always will be. It's time everyone recognized that up front, even Randall. I think he'd benefit from getting out of the religious con job. How about you?
The real question, it's loaded, meaning that it conceals a controversial implicit premise. And in this case, the controversial implicit premise is that God is worship worthy.
Yes, that is true, but you're still missing the whole point that God hasn't been shown to be real in the first place. Randall, I figure, suffers from the same problem that most Christians, most theists do. They just assume that their beliefs are valid, even if they have never been demonstrated to be so. They really want it to be true, so it's just got to be true, so there. But for the non-religious, that isn't the case. Christianity hasn't been proven to be valid, if it's simply not because. So you can't just implicitly assume that the first part of the question is true when it hasn't been demonstrated in any way, shape, or form. I'm not even going to begin to care about the second part until then. That's why Frank is asking this question in a room filled with Christians, not with skeptics. He knows that they'll just dance past the problematic first part, and we can't do that, and we can't allow them to do it either. That's why this whole thing is so blatantly dishonest.
And many people believe, in fact, that if God exists, God is not worship worthy. They may believe that because of the problem of evil as expressed and experienced through things like the Holocaust or animal suffering, or perhaps the violence described in the book of Joshua as Israel invades Canaan and massacres civilians.
Yes, but you're missing the whole point, Randall. Now, granted, I'm just responding to a video. It's not like he can hear me and change his responses, but I think this point cannot be overlooked. The religious are just assuming that something is true without having validated it first, and that means you simply can't even evaluate the second half of the question intelligently. If a God exists, that doesn't mean it's necessarily your God. That doesn't mean that you can even understand what your God is like, because you can't evaluate your God in any rational way. This is just stuff that you believe, but not anything that you can actually prove. So I can't remotely answer that, because I don't know what the God you're proposing is actually like, only what you claim about it, and let's be honest, your claims are entirely empty. You have no more means of knowing anything about any real existing God than I do, because in order to know anything about a God, you have to be able to study the God. And that's why the first part of this comes first. You can't even talk about the second part in any meaningful way otherwise.
Or the problem of hell, the idea of God torturing people seemingly for eternity in eternal conscious torment, or God capriciously sending people to hell because they haven't heard the gospel and haven't had an opportunity to respond, or God punishing his own son on the cross in a penal substitutionary understanding of atonement. We could go on and on and on.
Or the fact that, according to your own beliefs, all of this stuff is done intentionally. God knew what would happen, and did it anyhow. Anyone that goes to hell, it's all God's fault because he knew it would happen. He created these people for no other reason than for them to fry. Your God is a dick. It's really where this whole thing goes so wrong, even according to your own beliefs. Why can't the religious figure this out? I'd really like to know. Because A, not only do they not have any way to know anything at all about their gods, and that ought to be painfully easy for anyone who just stops to think about it for 10 seconds, but B, the stuff that they've just made up about their gods, and it is stuff that they've just made up, it just makes their gods look like a fucking asshole. This is not a good thing, but they're too terrified of this imaginary monster in the sky that they've made up to actually think about their beliefs rationally. Well, we can't question God. Well, why the fuck not? What the hell is wrong with you? That Jew in the concentration camp? They had it right. God has a lot of explaining to do if any of this is real at all. Good thing we don't have any reason to think that any of it is, huh?
In all of these cases, there could be views about God. Oh, here's one more. A crude anthropomorphized understanding of who God is, as like a bearded man in the sky who capriciously hurls thunderbolts down to the earth. A God who strikes one person with cancer for no particular reason and allows the evil to flourish on earth.
You're really not helping your case, Randall. Your God is a prick. So why do you worship it? Especially since there's no rational reason whatsoever to think that it's real in the first place. This is where religion poisons a working mind. Randall clearly understands the problems, yet he still professes belief, right? Granted, he's become the tentative apologist in recent history. I don't really know how far back that goes, but this is a guy on his way into atheism if ever I've seen one. But he's not there yet. Trust me, I understand that it takes time and it's really hard to jettison the religious baggage, but once you get to the point that you know all the problems and you can see all the bullshit, you understand that it's entirely unsupported. Yet you believe it anyhow? That's kinda dumb. This is the time for some serious self-reflection. You have to care more about reality than you do about your own childish fifis. You have to stop lying to yourself. Try.
I mean, you could go on and on with examples. The point being that simply assuming that a person would not worship God or accept the truth of Christianity, even if it were true, and would not worship and bow to God, even if God did exist, doesn't in and of itself tell you anything about whether they are open or resistant to the truth of Christianity.
Because it's not even a coherent question yet. Randall is just assuming that Christianity is true. His version of Christianity, not the ones he disagrees with. Why? Because he likes it. But that doesn't mean anything. It's completely irrational to go on fifis and faith, but that's all the religious have. There are so many problems with their theology that they refuse to even acknowledge because they aren't remotely interested in the truth of the proposition. They just really want to believe. Whereas I don't. I have no vested interest in believing what they believe until it is proven to be actually true in a way that I can test independently for myself. If doesn't matter. When does. When Christianity is proven to be true, I will evaluate it like I would any other fact about reality. Only then will I have any reason to consider it intellectually. Until then, it's just fantasy, and that's something I don't think Randall is capable of admitting to quite yet.
What it could simply say is the Christian has failed to complete their apologetic task of showing that if God exists, then God is in fact worship worthy. So don't ask questions like that, and don't think that a question like that, which gets a negative response, somehow lets the apologist off the hook. It may, in fact, simply be evidence that the apologist has simply failed to make their own case. It is not an exoneration of you, and it is not an indictment of the skeptic.
Randall, let me explain something to you here, and I'm doing this as honestly as I can. You are assuming that Frank Turek is being honest, which he absolutely is not. He's a con man, pure and simple. He's only saying that because he knows that it's going to resonate with his religious meal ticket. He gets the response that he wants from the audience that he wants because it benefits him like he wants. This is not an honest question any more than it is in the debate 30 years ago. It is designed to get an emotional response, not from the skeptic, but from the religious audience. Once you start to realize just how dishonest religion actually is, the entire underpinning falls apart. It's a scam, nothing more. It's designed to enrich the apologists and the preachers because that's what they're really after. Always has been and always will be. Pretending otherwise, it only makes you look foolish, and that's not a good thing. You can be so much better than that if you'd even try. So, anyhow, what did you all think about this? I really like how Randal Rauser is starting to talk, but he hasn't gone quite far enough. He might never go far enough, we don't know. Clinging to the irrationality of religious belief, that's a damn hard thing to get rid of if you're not ready to stand on your own 2 feet and deal with the reality that you actually live in. He's getting close though, at least closer than a lot of other theists ever do. So let me know your views down in the comments, because I think I'm going to keep a closer eye on Randall in the future and maybe do some more videos if I find some that I like. And if you find some that you like, you know what to do. Let me know down in the comments. I'm not being critical of Randall because he's actually taking those first tentative steps at throwing off the shackles of religion. And that's a really good thing if you think about it. I wish more people could do it, but most theists, they're just deluded out of their ever-loving gourds. And that part of it, that's not a good thing.